How are you all?
Good.
Good. Just in case you forgot, I guess we'll take our name tags with us.
That's all right.
Yeah.
So you don't forget who you are.
Well, that's true too, right? That's true too.
How you doing?
Good, thanks.
Well, there's no particular order. So if you've got a question that you'd like to ask, why don't we just
Can I
dive right in?
sneak in two?
Yes, I think you probably can by the looks around here, and then we'll go around to somebody else. How's that?
My first question is, will you be able to work with neighborhood associations, and which includes Matthew 25? I don't know if you're familiar with the neighborhood association, Matthew 25.
Yeah.
And I'll throw this other one out. You already brought some of it, so you already answered this about the flood control.
Yeah.
Do you have facts? Will you present it to the people as soon as you know them and stuff? Them are the two questions I have.
Sure. Absolutely, we'll work with neighborhood associations. In particular, I'm most familiar with Wellington Heights and Oak Hill Jackson neighborhood associations. I represented those areas when I was in the legislature. I visited a number of others, the Northwest, Ellis Harbor, and I really think that's one of the great assets of our community is that we have engaged folks that want to dig in at the neighborhood level and deal with issues like public safety, how the neighborhood looks, and really kind of get in at that micro level and solve a lot of problems. So to me, the city should be there to help those neighborhood associations identify the issues that are most important, prioritize them, and then provide some resources, in order to get them fixed. I know that each of them has a liaison, usually with the police department. I often, run into the officers there that go to those different meetings. Public Works, Parks. To me, every city department should have that same engagement at the neighborhood level. As far as city or flood protection goes, absolutely. It's been a long process to get to where we are now, but I think that public input is so important in order to build trust. There has been a lot of debate about how exactly to do flood protection, how much it should cost, who should pay, how should we pay, and I think ultimately that engaged discussion leads to consensus. Not total unanimity probably, but consensus at least on how to move forward as a community. And ultimately, I think if you go that route and get that input, people will be willing to get behind it, right? And rally around and get the job done. So that's really the process I would take, not just to flood protection, but a lot of different issues.
This lady here has.
Yeah.
I have a question. When you were a state representative, why did you allow such loose language for the flood funding so that, like, if a building wants to build next to the river, as long as they have part of the flood, flood protection, then we'll be footing that bill. Why did you allow that?
Are you talking about for rebuilding, or recovery,
Yeah,
or for the wall
flood
and protection? Well, so recovery. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, there were probably about 3 years of things that happened, right? So $30 million was approved right away so that people could start to get back in their homes, repair, renovate, really start just the initial part of getting their lives back together. The longer term then was up to about $300 or $400 million for flood protection, which is the most expensive part of the process. So the way that the legislation was written is that it required contribution at the local level, then the state level, which is the part that obviously we were most involved with, and then the federal level. And that's really what the city's been pursuing probably for the last 5 years.
I was in Des Moines when we were lobbying for the language to be tightened. I am a flood victim, and as a flood victim, I don't want any of the public to pay for my protection. We have insurance.
Well, and that's great that you feel like you're taken care of and protected and moving forward. I think the community, though, owes it to not just the people along the river, but the whole community to protect the. If you'd let me finish, I'd appreciate it. To protect the community assets that are there. Whether it's recreational assets, whether it's city and county buildings, public buildings. I think as a community we should protect those assets. We should protect the homes of the people that wanted to stay, and we should protect those businesses. So that's why I led the effort to make sure that we got hundreds of millions of dollars, and I think we need to get that process going quicker.
So do you favor the sales tax to fund flood control here in the city?
Well, so the flood protection at the funding mechanism at the state level takes growth in sales tax. So it's not an extra sales tax. What it does is say, City of Cedar Rapids, in a certain year you collect X amount. For math, let's just say $10 million. The next year, because of increased economic activity, economy's getting better, more people moving into the area, the next year it might be $12 million. And so what the city can do is keep a portion of that growth in order to fund flood protection. So that's how that's where the state's funding comes from. The federal government obviously hasn't allocated their portion of it yet, and I don't think they will anytime soon, which is why I think we need to get started. At a city level, the city hasn't made that decision yet about where exactly to find that local match. And there are a number of different options that have been brought up. So to me, that's a conversation the community has to have. Ultimately, though, the city council has to, I think, get that process moving quicker to identify what that city source is going to be to match that state funding. So it is funded. It's funded by sales tax growth at the state level. It's not an extra sales tax, though. It's just a portion of the growth that the city sees. Does that answer your question?
No, I want to know what your position is on the city instituting that.
Oh, doing a sales tax?
Sales tax.
So right now we're maxed at sales tax. We couldn't do one if we wanted to. We're at the state level, maximum level. Right now we're using the quote-unquote extra penny for roads for 10 years. To me, we should continue to do the roads. We're 3 years into that. When we get to year maybe 7, right, we need to decide whether or not we want to ditch that, not do the sales tax at all, whether we want to re-up it for roads, or whether we want to try to get it approved by voters to do something else. Flood protection might be one of those things. Ultimately, the community is going to decide that. That has to be approved by a vote of the citizens. Right now, like I said, we have 7 more years of roads, and it'll stay roads for 7 years.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you meet people in the community, what seems to be the biggest concern that people have for our city going forward? And how are we going to solve it, fix it, address it?
Roads. I hear a lot about roads, whether it's fixing potholes, in the streets that honestly did not get the attention that they needed for a long time, and so now we're behind. I hear a lot in certain neighborhoods about stormwater. During big rainstorms, the stormwater infrastructure can't keep up, and so streets flood, it's backing up into people's houses. So we're having a lot of those types of events. I hear about flood protection. People asking kind of what that process is and where it is. Obviously the economy is always on people's minds, particularly with Rockwell, being sold. That has a lot of people thinking about jobs. What happens with that. So I think I named 3 issues there. Those are about the top 3 I would say that I get asked about the most.
I got one more from somebody else, and that is, Mr. Corbett brought this up in one of the state city addresses, and that is the housing that's still dilapidated from the 08 flood. It's going on almost 10 years. Is this, and the state house, I think, has helped some of the rules to think the city can take care of these, but still, there's still some with open windows, not boarded up, and like Corbett said, they're an eyesore for people that come in, visitors see that what kind of city would let that go? That's my question. Do you have a plan that, as a city council member, to approach that, to get these places cleaned up somehow?
Well, so I have heard that issue brought up before, particularly the Northwest neighbors. Some of those, the people in that neighborhood association have brought that up with me. And it's not just an eyesore. It can attract crime. And there's just a lot of problems with those. So, there is a process though that the city has to go through, right? I mean, a lot of them are private property, right? You can't just seize it, or to make those changes. As I'm sure you all have probably heard, the city has done a lot with nuisance properties or properties across the city that have generated a large number of law enforcement calls, for example, code violations, and that kind of thing. And so to me, we need to apply, that kind of process, because property owners should be given that process. But ultimately, you have to get to a spot where if those measures don't take place, then you have to force action, right? And so the city has some tools available to it in order to force that action at the end of the process, and we should, because it's not just that property that's affected, it's the whole neighborhood. Surrounding property values can be lowered because of it, and those issues spill over into the community. So we need to follow the process, because I think that private property rights need to be respected, but ultimately the city needs to force some action.
Yeah.
Other questions from anybody else that hasn't spoken yet? Okay.
What incentives should the city be giving to businesses like tax increment financing?
Well, so to me, I think that cities in general, I don't think Cedar Rapids is abnormal in this regard, has relied too heavily on abatement, TIF, in order to do its economic development. We obviously compete with other communities in the state, in the country, around the world, for businesses and for jobs, and I think we should, be a tough competitor. To me, what I would like to see, and I think the Rockwell example is kind of illustrative of this, ultimately I think we can build a competitive advantage with the people that we have. Skills that people have, we have great work ethic of folks here in our community. In a community where people feel like they're engaged. And to me, those things can't be bought, right? Because what ends up happening a lot of times in these incentive situations is they come for 7 or 8 years, whatever the agreement is on the TIF or the incentives, and then that agreement expires, and they go out again to 10 different communities and they say, okay, now what do you have for me, right? And they continually put their business basically up for sale, right, up for auction. So to me, if we keep working on those things that you can't buy, that aren't transferable, things like connection to our natural resources, an entrepreneurial, innovative spirit, those are the things that I think will attract businesses. Education system, for example, is another great one. Not just K-12, but also our community colleges and private colleges. If we have things that you can't find anywhere else, those incentives become less and less important. So to me, I guess that was a long way of saying, the short answer is there are going to be select situations, I think, where it's appropriate to use incentives. One, if a project would not happen but for those incentives, and then two, that they're at a level, at the lowest level possible in order to make the project happen. 3, you have accountability so that they live up to those promises. But ultimately, I think longer term, we need to be working on those things that as a community we can have as a competitive advantage that you can't just get up and find somewhere else.
2 minutes. Is there another question somebody would like to ask?
Do we have a problem with the misuse of tax, and if so, why do you say that?
Well, I think we do, and I guess I say that because if we're having even one incident, to me is a problem, and so we clearly have that, and unfortunately we have had more than that in the past. This year has been a little bit lower than in the past, and to me we really need to approach it as a public health issue. I think for a long time we've treated it just as a law enforcement issue, but I think by using a lot of the same tools that we use in a public health situation to find kind of the cause of an epidemic, for example, Zika virus or Ebola or whatever it is, we can get a lot better answer to the question. So I would propose a process where we reviewed every single incident of gun violence from a multi-perspective approach. So you have public health, law enforcement, the faith community, leaders of different civic organizations, community organizations that are active in the neighborhood, and really kind of dig in and hopefully then come up with a solution overall that solves kind of the problem before it got to, whatever that incident was where a gun was used. So I think it absolutely is an issue. To me, it's an issue if it happens even once. And I think kind of the traditional way of approaching it is not the right way. I think we can do better looking at it from a more holistic perspective. Yeah.
So we're done. Oh, 15 seconds.
15 seconds? Well, how about I just say thank you? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can answer a question in 15 seconds. I'm not able to do that, but like I said, I appreciate y'all coming and asking questions. We learn a lot too, not just you, so we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep. Enjoy the rest of the evening. You're welcome. I got to take my name tag with me too.